Beginning on the other end of the line, forming the left wing of Bragg's battle array, were Preston, Hindman and Bushrod Johnson, with Law and Kershaw in reserve. Confronting these, beginning on the extreme Union right and forming the right wing of Rosecrans's army, were Sheridan, Davis, Wood, Negley and Brannan, with Wilder and Van Cleve in reserve. The bloody work was inaugurated by Breckinridge's assault upon the Union left. The Confederates, with a ringing yell, broke through the Federal line. Confederate General Helm, with his gallant Kentuckians, rushed upon the Union breastworks and was hurled back, his command shattered. He was killed and his colonels shot down. Again rallying, assaulting and recoiling, this decimated command temporarily yielded its place in line. The Federals, in a furious countercharge, drove back the Confederates under Adams, and his body was also left upon the field. The Chickamauga River was behind the Confederates, Missionary Ridge behind the Federals. On its slopes were Union batteries pouring a storm of shell into the forests through which Bragg's forces were bravely charging. As the Confederates under Adams and Helm were borne back, the clear ring of Pat Cleburne's "Forward" was heard, and forward they moved, their alignment broken by treetops and tangled brush and burning shells. His superb troops pressed through the storm, only to recoil under the concentrated fire of artillery and the blazing muzzles of small arms from the Federals behind their breastworks. The whole Confederate right, brigade after brigade, in successive and repeated charges, now furiously assailed the Union breastworks, only to recoil broken and decimated. Walthall, with his fiery Mississippians, was repulsed, with all his field officers dead or wounded and his command torn into shreds. The gallant Georgians rushed into the consuming blasts, and their brilliant leader, Peyton Colquitt, fell, with many of his brave boys around him, close to the Union breastworks. The Confederates under Walker, Cleburne and Stewart with wild shouts charged the works held by the determined forces of Reynolds, Brannan and Baird. Bravely these Union troops stood to their posts, but the Southern forces at one point broke through their front as Breckinridge swept down upon flank and rear. George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, with full appreciation of the crisis, called for help to hold this pivotal position of the Union left. Vanderveer's moving banners indicated the quick step of his troops responding to Thomas's call, and raked by flanking fire, this dashing officer drove Breckinridge back and relieved the Union flank. At double quick and with ringing shout, the double Union lines pressed forward until, face to face and muzzle to muzzle, the fighting became fierce and desperate. Charging columns of blue and grey at this moment rushed against each other, and both were shattered in the fearful impact. The superb Southern leader, Deschler, fell at the head of his decimated command. Govan's Mississippians and Brown's Tennesseans were forced back when Bate, also of Tennessee, pressed furiously forward, captured the Union artillery, and drove the Federals to their breastworks. Again and quickly the scene was changed. Fresh Union batteries and supporting infantry with desperate determination overwhelmed and drove back temporarily, the Confederates led by the knightly Stewart. Still farther westward, Longstreet drove his column like a wedge into the Union right centre, ripping asunder the steady line of the Federal divisions. In this whirlwind of battle, amidst its thunders and blinding flashes, the heroic Hood rode, encouraging his men, and fell desperately wounded. His leading line was shattered into fragments, but his stalwart supports pressed on over his own and the Union dead, capturing the first Union line. Halting only to reform under fearful fire, they started for the second Union position. Swaying, reeling, almost breaking, they nevertheless captured that second line and drove up the ridge and over it the Federal fighters, who bravely resisted at every step. Whizzing shells from opposing batteries crossed each other as they tore through the forest, rending saplings and tumbling severed limbs and treetops amidst the surging ranks. Wilder's mounted Union brigade in furious charge swept down upon Manigault's Confederates, flank and rear, and drove them in wild confusion, but the Union horsemen were in turn quickly driven from the field and beyond the ridge. Battery after battery of Union artillery was captured by the advancing Confederates. The roaring tide of battle, with alternate waves of success for both sides, surged around Snodgrass House and Horseshoe Ridge. Before a furious and costly Confederate charge, the whole extreme Union right was broken and driven from the field. Negley's shattered lines of blue abandoned the position and retreated to Rossville with the heavy batteries. Davis, with decimated Union lines under Carlin and Hegg, moved into Negley's position, but these were driven to the right and rear. Onward, still onward, swept the Confederate columns. Checked here, broken there, they closed the gaps and pressed forward, scattering Van Cleve's veterans in wild disorder. Amidst the shouting, Confederates rode their leaders, Stuart, Buckner, Preston, Kershaw, and Johnson. The gallant McCook led in person a portion of Sheridan's troops with headlong fury against the southern front, and Sheridan himself rode among his troops, rallying his broken lines and endeavouring to check the resistless southern advance. The brave and brilliant Little of the Union Army, soldier and poet, at this point paid to valour and duty the tribute of his heart's blood. The Confederate momentum, however, scattered these decimated Union lines and compelled them to join the retreating columns, filling the roads in the rear. Rosecrans, McCook, and Crittenden rode to Chattanooga to select another line for defence. In the furious tempest there now came one of those strange, unexpected lulls, but the storm was only gathering fresh fury. In the comparative stillness which pervaded the field, its mutterings could still be heard. Its lightnings were next to flash, and its thunders to roll around Horseshoe Summit. Along that crest and around Snodgrass House, the remaining troops of Rosecrans's left wing planted themselves for stubborn resistance, one of the most stubborn recorded in history. To meet the assault of Longstreet's wing, the brave Union General Brannan, standing upon this now historic crest, rallied the remnants of Croxton, Wood, Harker, Beatty, Stanley, Van Cleve, and Buell. But up the long slopes, the exulting Confederate ranks moved in majestic march. As they neared the summit, a sheet of flame from Union rifles and heavy guns blazed into their faces. Before the blast, the charging Confederates staggered, bent and broke. Reforming at the foot of the slope, these dauntless men in grey moved again to still more determined assault upon the no less dauntless Union lines firmly planted on the crest. Through the blinding fires, they rushed to a hand-to-hand conflict, breaking here, pushing forward there, in terrible struggle. Through clouds of smoke around the summit, the banners and bayonets of Hindman's Confederates were discovered upon the crest. When Gordon, Granger, and Steedman, with fresh troops, hurried from the Union left, and joining Vanderveer, hurled Hindman and his men from this citadel of strength, and held it till the final Union retreat. With bayonets and clubbed muskets, the resolute Federals pierced and beat back the charging Confederates, covering the slopes of Snodgrass Hill with Confederate dead. Roaring like a cyclone through the forest, the battle storm raged. Battery answered battery, deepening the unearthly din and belching from their heated throats the consuming iron hail. The woods caught fire from the flaming shells and scorched the bodies of dead and dying. At the close of the day, the Union forces had been driven from every portion of the field except Snodgrass Hill, and as the sun sank behind the cliffs of Lookout Mountain, hiding his face from one of the bloodiest scenes enacted by human hands, this heroic remnant of Rosecrans's army withdrew to the rear and then to the works around Chattanooga, leaving the entire field of Chickamauga to the battered but triumphant and shouting Confederates. It is not my purpose to enter the controversy as to numbers brought into action by Bragg and Rosecrans respectively. General Longstreet makes the strength of the two armies practically equal. General Boynton's figures give to Bragg superiority in numbers. It is sufficient for my purpose to show that the courage displayed by both sides was never surpassed in civilized or barbaric warfare, that there is glory enough to satisfy both, that the fighting from first to last was furious, that there was enough precious blood spilt by those charging and recoiling columns in the deadly hand-to-hand collisions on the 19th and 20th of September to immortalize the prowess of American soldiery and make Chickamauga a Mecca through all the ages. the fact that both sides claim a victory is somewhat remarkable. General H.V. Boynton, who fought under General Rosecrans, to whose vigorous pen and wise labours much credit is due for the success of the great battle park at Chickamauga, and who is one of the ablest and fairest of the commentators upon this memorable struggle, has devoted much time and labour to prove that the victory was with the Union arms. With sincere friendship for General Boynton as a man and a soldier, and with full appreciation of his ability and sense of justice, I must be permitted to suggest that his reasoning will scarcely stand the test of unbiased historical criticism. His theory is that although General Rosecrans abandoned the field after 2 days of determined and desperate fighting in the effort to hold it, yet his retirement was not a retreat, but an advance. At nightfall, says General Boynton, the army advanced to Chattanooga. The Army of the Cumberland was on its way to Chattanooga, the city it set out to capture. Every foot of it, the march, was a march in advance and not retreat. History will surely ask how this retrograde movement into the trenches at Chattanooga can fairly be considered an advance, the object of which was to capture the city, when that city had been evacuated by Bragg and occupied by Rosecrans 10 days before, when it was held by the Union forces already, and when that city was then, and had been for many days, the base of Union supplies and operations. General Boynton ignores the dominating fact that before the battle the faces of the Union Army were toward Atlanta and their backs were upon Chattanooga. The battle induced Rosecrans to about-face and go in the opposite direction. The same reasoning as that employed by General Boynton would give to McClellan the victory in the 7 days' battles around Richmond, for he too had beaten back the Confederates at certain points and had escaped with his army to the cover of his gunboats at Harrison's Landing. From like premises, the Confederates might claim a victory for Lee at Gettysburg, and that his movement to the rear was an advance. General Pope might in like manner claim that the rout at Second Manassas was a victory, and his retreat to Washington an advance which saved the capital. To my thought, such victories are similar to that achieved by the doctor who was asked, "Well, doctor, how is the mother and the new baby?" "They are both dead," replied the doctor. "But I have saved the old man." The advance on Atlanta was checked, Chickamauga was lost, but like the doctor's old man, Chattanooga was saved. General Boynton is too sensitive in this matter. All great commanders in modern times, the most consummate and successful, have had their reverses. General Rosecrans had unfortunate opposition at Washington, and his record as commander under such conditions is brilliant enough to take the sting out of his defeat at Chickamauga. His ability as a strategist, his skill in manoeuvre, and his vigour in delivering battle are universally recognized. The High Court of History will render its verdict in accordance with the facts. These facts are simple and indisputable. First, Bragg threw his army across Rosecrans's front, checked his advance, and forced him to take position on the north bank of the Chickamauga. Second, Bragg assailed Rosecrans in his chosen stronghold, drove him from the entire field, and held it in unchallenged possession. Third, at the end of the 2 days' battle, which in courage and carnage has scarcely a parallel, as the two wings of the Confederate Army met on the field, their battle flags waved triumphantly above every gory acre of it, and their ringing shouts rolled through Chickamauga's forests and rose to heaven, a mighty anthem of praise and gratitude to God for the victory. Chapter 15. Missionary Ridge, Triune Disaster. General Lee was not a believer in the infallibility of newspapers as arbiters of military movements. With full appreciation of their enormous power and vital agency in arousing, guiding, and ennobling public sentiment, his experience with them as military critics of his early campaigns in the West Virginia mountains had led him to question the wisdom of some of their suggestions. In a letter to Mrs. Lee, he once wrote, in half-serious, half-jocular strain, that he had been reading the papers, and that he would be glad if they had entire control and could fix matters to suit themselves, adding, "General Floyd has 3 editors on his staff, and I hope something may be done to please them." General Bragg had been subjected to a somewhat similar fire from the rear for not following General Rosecrans after the Battle of Chickamauga and driving him into the river or across it. That he did not do so, and thus make the Battle of Missionary Ridge impossible and save his army from its crushing defeat there, was a disappointment not only to the watchful and expectant press, but to the Southern people, and to some of the leaders who fought under him at Chickamauga. A calm review of the situation and the facts as they existed at the time will demonstrate, I think, that his failure to follow and assault General Rosecrans in his strong works at Chattanooga was not only pardonable, but prudent and wise. The Confederate victory at Chickamauga, which was the most conspicuous antecedent of Missionary Ridge, was achieved after 2 days of desperate fighting and at tremendous cost. While the Confederates had inflicted heavy losses upon the Union Army, they had also suffered heavy losses. Of the 33,000 dead and wounded, practically one-half wore grey uniforms. For every Union regiment broken and driven in disorder from the field, there was a Confederate regiment decimated and shattered in front of the breastworks. The final retreat of the Union Army was immediately preceded by successful repulses and countercharges, and by the most determined stand against the desperate and repeated Confederate assaults on Snodgrass Hill. General Bragg's right wing had been partially shattered in front of the Union field works in the woods at Chickamauga, and his left wing held in check till near nightfall at Snodgrass Hill. It seems to me, therefore, that these facts constitute almost a mathematical demonstration, at least a moral assurance, that his army must have failed in an immediate march across the open plain through the network of wire spread for Confederate feet, in the face of wide-sweeping Union artillery, and against the infinitely stronger works at Chattanooga. In whatever other respects General Bragg may be regarded by his critics as worthy of blame, it seems manifestly unfair to charge that he blundered in not pursuing Rosecrans after Chickamauga. Far more just would be criticisms of General McClellan for his refusal to renew the attack in the open after Sharpsburg, Antietam, or of General Meade for not accepting the gauge of battle tendered him by Lee after the repulse of Gettysburg, or of General Lee himself for not pressing Burnside after Fredericksburg, Hooker after Chancellorsville, and Pope after the rout at Second Manassas. These reflections are submitted in the interest of truth and injustice to General Bragg's memory. They are submitted after the most patient and painstaking investigation, and I must confess that they are in direct conflict with the impressions I had myself received and the opinions which I entertained before investigation. One other remark as to General Bragg's halt after the Confederate victory at Chickamauga. His beleaguering of the Union Army for a whole month in its stronghold at Chattanooga is by no means conclusive evidence that he blundered in his failure to immediately assault General Rosecrans in his entrenchments. While admitting that, however shattered the ranks of the victor, the ranks of the beaten army are always in still worse condition, it must be remembered that assaults against breastworks, as a rule, are most expensive operations. Pemberton had been beaten in a series of engagements before he was driven into his works at Vicksburg, yet with his small force he successfully repelled for months every assault made upon those breastworks by General Grant. General Lee's hitherto victorious veterans recoiled before the natural battlements of the Round Tops and Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg. On June 27, 1864, General Sherman assaulted with tremendous power the strong position held by General Joseph E. Johnston's retreating army. But General Sherman's loss was nearly 10 for every Confederate killed or wounded. The experience of General Nathaniel P. Banks in his assault upon the Confederate forces behind their breastworks at Port Hudson furnishes possibly a still more convincing proof of this truth. Page after page of similar illustrations might be taken from the records of our Civil War. It may be true that Chickamauga had brought temporary demoralization to portions of Rosecrans's army. It may be true that General Grant did say to General Sherman at Chattanooga, "The men of Thomas's army have been so demoralized by the Battle of Chickamauga that I fear they cannot be got out of their trenches to assume the offensive." But when he witnessed their superb assault upon Missionary Ridge, he must have changed his opinion. It may be true, It is true that had General Bragg assailed the Union Army after Chickamauga, he would have had the advantage of the momentum and ardour imparted to a column in a charge, but he would also have been compelled to overcome the feeling of security imparted to troops protected by heavy breastworks and the increased effectiveness of their fire. General Longstreet assailed the breastworks at Knoxville after the Chickamauga battle, but his superb battalions were powerless before them. General Bragg's mistake, therefore, it seems to me, was not his decision to besiege rather than assault the Union Army in Chattanooga, but it was the weakening of his lines by detaching for other service such large bodies as to reduce his army to a mere skeleton of its former strength. While Bragg was reducing his troops to an estimated force of about 25,000 men by sending off Longstreet and Buckner and the Confederate cavalry, General Grant, who had displaced Rosecrans and assumed command at Chattanooga, was increasing his army in and around that city to 100,000 or more. By his official report, it seems that after the arrival of his two corps from the east and General Sherman's army from the west, he had on the 25th of November, when the advance was ordered, about 86,000 men, armed and equipped, ready for the assault. I recall no instance in the history of our war, and few in any other war, where, on so contracted a field, was marshalled for battle so gigantic and puissant an army. More than 2,000 years ago occurred a scene which Missionary Ridge recalls. On the plains of Marathon, Datis, under the orders of King Darius, assembled his army of Persian warriors, whose number did not differ widely from those commanded at Chattanooga by General Grant. Confronting Datis was the little army of the Greeks under Miltiades, the great Athenian, in whose veins ran the blood of Hercules. Posted along the Attican range of mountains, this little army of Athenians looked down upon the vast hosts assembled against them on the Marathon plain below, as Bragg's small force of Confederates stood on Missionary Ridge and the slopes of Lookout Mountain, contemplating the magnificent but appalling panorama of Grant's overwhelming legions, moving from their works and wheeling into lines of battle. The two scenes, the one at Marathon, the other at Chattanooga, present other strikingly similar features. The ground on which the respective armies under Datis and Grant were assembled bore a close resemblance the one to the other. Crescent-shaped Marathon, washed by the winding bay, had its counterpart in that crescent formed at Chattanooga by the Tennessee as it flows around the city. The Greeks at Marathon and the Confederates at Missionary Ridge were each moved by a kindred impulse of self-defense. The Athenian republicans under Miltiades, as they stood upon the bordering hills around Marathon, realized that the spirits of departed Grecian heroes were hovering above them, and resolved not to survive the loss of Athenian freedom or the enslavement of their people. They were the foremost men of their time. The mountain on which they stood was sacred ground. Every stone and scene was an inspiration. The American Republicans of Southern birth and training who stood with Bragg on Missionary Ridge were imbued with an ardour none the less strong and sacred. At this point, however, vast contrasts appear. The Grecian commander was to fight Persians, the Southern leader was to meet Americans. The hireling hordes which swarmed on the plains of Marathon served not from choice, but from compulsion. The Persian array was a vast conglomeration of incohesive elements, imposing in aspect but weak in determined battle. The army which Bragg was to meet was composed of patriotic volunteers, every man impelled by a thorough belief in the righteousness of his cause. At Marathon, it was the resolute, compact, and self-sacrificing Grecian phalanxes against the uncertain, disjointed, and self-seeking hordes of Persian plunderers. It was heroes against hirelings, the glorious sons of Athenian, freedom against the submissive serfs of triumphant wrong and of kingly power. At Missionary Ridge, it was patriot against patriot, inherited beliefs against inherited beliefs, liberty as embodied in the sovereignty of the states against liberty as embodied in the perpetuity of the Union. The Persians represented organized vindictiveness. The haughty monarch Darius had resolved to wreak his vengeance on the free people of Athens. In his besotted pride and blasphemy, he implored the gods to give him strength to punish these free men of Greece. His servants were instructed constantly to repeat to him as he gorged himself with costly viands, "Sire, remember the Athenians." The army and commanders whom he sent to Marathon were fit agents for the execution of so diabolical a purpose. Numbers, therefore, did not count for much in the conflict with such men as Miltiades led against them. The Federals and Confederates, however, who met each other at Missionary Ridge, were of the same race and of kindred impulse. They gathered their strength and ardour from the memories and example of the same rebelling fathers. In such a contest, numbers did tell and gave to General Grant the moral assurance of victory even before the battle was joined. The Union assault on Missionary Ridge was heralded by the Battle Above the Clouds, as the fight on Lookout Mountain is called. Important events had transpired, which precipitated that conflict amidst the heavy vapours around Lookout Mountain. These events rendered the capture of that citadel of strength possible, if not easy. Nearly 10,000 Federals under General Hooker had forced a passage of the Tennessee below Lookout Point, driving back the two Confederate regiments, numbering about 1,000 men, commanded by the gallant Colonel Gates of Alabama, who fell severely wounded while making a most stubborn resistance. The night battle at Wauhatchie had also been fought, and the small Confederate force had been defeated. It was in this fire in the darkness that the brave little Billy Bethune of Georgia made his debut as a soldier and his exit on an Irishman's shoulder. The Irishman who was carrying Billy off the field was asked by his major, "Who is that you are carrying to the rear?" "Billy Bethune, sir." "Is he wounded?" "Yes, sir. He's shot in the back, sir." This was more than Billy could endure, and he shouted his indignant answer to the Irishman. "Major, he's an infernal liar. I am shot across the back, sir." The Hon. John Russell Young, in his book Around the World with General Grant, states that this great Union general once said, "The Battle of Lookout Mountain, the battle above the clouds, is one of the romances of the war. There was no such battle, and no action worthy to be called a battle, on Lookout Mountain. It is all poetry." I shall not enter into the controversy as to the rank which should be assigned to that brief but noted conflict. Whatever may be its proper designation, it was a most creditable affair to both sides. Reared among the mountains, I can readily appreciate the peculiar atmospheric conditions and the impressive character of the scenes which met those contending forces on the rugged mountain side. Many times in my boyhood I have stood upon those mountain tops in the clear sunlight, while below were gathered dense fogs and mists, sometimes following the winding courses of the streams, often covering the valleys like a vast sea and obscuring them from view. As stated in another chapter, General Hooker was probably not apprised of the fact that there confronted him in the forenoon only Walthal's Mississippians, less than 1,500 men against 10,000, and in the afternoon only the shattered remnants of this brave little brigade, joined by 3 regiments of Pettus and the small brigade of Moore, in all probably not more than 2,500 men. The conception of moving upon an unknown force located in such a stronghold was bold and most creditable to the high soldierly qualities of General Hooker and the gallant men who moved at his command through the fogs and up the steeps, where gorges and boulders and jutting cliffs made almost as formidable barriers as those which opposed the American soldiers at Chapultepec. General Walthall, who commanded the little band of resisting Confederates, was compelled to stretch them out along the base and up the sides of the mountain until his command covered a front so long as to reduce it practically to a line of skirmishers. Far beyond the west flank of this attenuated line, Hooker's plan of battle for this unique field had placed a heavy force under enterprising and daring leaders. Up the mountainside the troops worked their way, clutching bushes and the branches of trees in order to lift themselves over the rugged ledges, firing as they rose, capturing small bodies here and there, and driving back the stubborn little band of Confederates. The Union lines in front and on Walthal's right threatened to make prisoners of his men, who retreated from ledge to ledge, pouring their fire into Hooker's troops and directing their aim only at the flashes of the Union rifles as they gleamed through the dense fog. The resistance of Walthall's Mississippians was pronounced by the distinguished Union leader, General George H. Thomas, obstinate, by General Bragg, the Confederate commander-in-chief, as desperate, and by the brave Steedman of the Union Army as sublimely heroic. More emphatic than all of these well-merited tributes was the eloquent fact that but 600 were left of the 1,500 carried into the fight. General Grant's arrival at Chattanooga with his reinforcements was as timely a relief for Thomas and his troops as the coming of Buell's forces had previously been for the succor of General Grant's army at Pittsburgh Landing or Shiloh. The interchange of courtesies which became so common during the war at no time interfered with the stern demands of duty. As General Manderson, one of the most gallant officers of the Union Army, rode near the Confederate picket lines in front of Chattanooga, he received a salutation almost as courteous as they would have given to one of their Confederate generals. Yet they were ready to empty their deadly rifles into the bosoms of his troops when they moved in battle array against them. General Manderson himself in these words gives account of the Confederate courtesy shown him. A feeling of amity, almost fraternization, had existed between the picket lines in front of Wood's division for many days. In the early morning of that day, being in charge of the left of our picket line, Union, I received a turnout and salute from the Confederate Reserve as I rode the line. This was on the very day of the great battle. On the river below, the Confederates would gladly have divided their own meagre rations with any individual soldier in Thomas's army. Yet they were attempting to shoot down every team and sink every boat which sought to bring the needed supplies to the beleaguered and hungry commands suffering in the city. Major Nelson of Indiana, who, like all truly brave soldiers, has exhibited in peace the same high qualities which distinguished him in war, gave me the following incident, which occurred at another point, and admirably illustrates the spirit of the best men in the two armies. Major Nelson was himself in command of the Union picket lines. The Confederate officer who stood at night in the opposing lines near him called out, "Hello there, Yank. Have you got any coffee over there?" "Yes," replied Major Nelson. "Come over and get some." "We would like to come, but there are 14 of us on this post." "All right, Johnny. Bring them all along. We'll divide with you. Come over, boys, and get your coffee." The Johnnies accepted. At 2 o'clock in the morning, they sat down in the trenches with the boys in blue and told war jokes on each other while drinking their coffee together. Looking at his watch, the Major said, "It's time for you Johnnies to get away from here. The inspector will be along soon, and he will put every one of you in prison, and me too, if he catches us at this business." The Confederates at once sprang to their feet and left with this salutation. "Good night, Yanks. We are greatly obliged to you. We have had a nice visit and enjoyed your coffee very much. We hope you will get a good rest tonight. We are going to give you hell tomorrow." When General Grant arrived at Chattanooga and had surveyed the field, he sent an order to General Sherman, who was rebuilding the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, to stop this work and move his army rapidly eastward toward Chattanooga. This order, it is said, was carried in a canoe down the Tennessee River over Muscle Shoals, and for a distance of probably 200 miles. The daring soldier who bore it was Corporal Pike, a noted scout. On the very day of Sherman's crossing the Tennessee at Chattanooga, Grant ordered the advance upon Missionary Ridge. To this ridge the Confederates had been withdrawn from their eyrie on Point Lookout, and the forces of Hooker swept down upon Bragg's left flank. Against Bragg's other flank, General Sherman's army was concentrated. In General Grant's admirable plan of the battle, the movement by Hooker against the Confederate left and the attack by Thomas upon its centre were intended as mere demonstrations, while the heavy columns of Sherman were to turn its right flank and completely envelop it, thus making the capture of the bulk of Bragg's small army probable, or rendering his retreat extremely hazardous. But as is often the case in battle, the unexpected transpired. Across the line of Sherman's advance, from which the greatest results were expected, was a railroad cut and tunnel from which the Confederates suddenly rushed upon the head of the Union column, checking, breaking, and routing it. In the meanwhile, Grant, who stood on Orchard Knob opposite the Confederate center, had ordered Thomas to move at a given signal and seize the Confederate rifle pits at the base of the ridge. As the 6 shots from Orchard Knob sounded the signal for the advance, the blue line of Thomas swept across the plain and into the rifle pits, making prisoners of many of the advanced Confederate skirmishers. This movement, as above stated, like Hooker's upon Lookout Mountain on the previous day, was intended by General Grant only as a demonstration, the purpose being only to take the rifle pits as a diversion to aid Sherman in his attack upon Bragg's right. The seasoned veterans of Thomas, however, were wiser in this instance, or at least bolder than the generals. Was it a misapprehension of orders? Was it recklessness? Or was it the habit acquired in battle of never halting when ordered forward under fire until their lines were broken against the solid fronts of opposing forces? General Grant was amazed when he saw those lines pass the rifle pits in furious charge toward the crest of Missionary Ridge. Both Thomas and Granger denied having given the order for such a movement. It was, however, too late to halt the troops, and most fortunate was it for the Union Army that the movement could not be recalled. Those brave men, without orders, mounted to the summit of Missionary Ridge, leaped into Bragg's entrenchments, piercing his lines in the centre, doubling them to the right and left, and forcing the front in confusion to the rear. The capture of 6,000 Southern prisoners, several pieces of artillery, and many thousand stands of small arms was an irreparable loss to the Confederacy. In its exhausted condition, these could not be replaced by new levies and new guns. Infinitely greater, however, was the loss of the prestige which Bragg's army had gained by the brilliant victory at Chickamauga just 2 months and 5 days before. Still greater was the loss which Missionary Ridge inflicted upon the Southern cause by opening the way to Atlanta. The bold and successful stand made after Missionary Ridge by Bragg's forces at Ringgold was but a temporary check to the advance of the Union forces. As Hooker's forces moved from the mountain top up Bragg's left, a Confederate officer, on his Kentucky thoroughbred, galloped into this portion of the Union line. It was young Breckinridge, looking for his father, General John C. Breckinridge, who was commanding a division of Confederates. Instead of his father, he found General James A. Williamson commanding Union troops. He lost his Kentucky racer and exchanged his staff position for that of prisoner of war. General Bragg, with patriotic purpose, and with the hope that some other commander might serve the cause more efficiently, asked to be relieved from the command of the army, and his request was granted. General Rosecrans had perhaps a still more pathetic fate. He had inaugurated and conducted against General Bragg during the summer a strategic campaign, pronounced by General Meigs, the greatest operation in our war. During the progress of this campaign, General George H. Thomas and the corps commanders of the Union Army seemed unanimous and enthusiastic in the commendation and support of it. Yet after its culmination, General Rosecrans was removed from the command of his army. From the standpoint of unbiased criticism, the future historian will probably have some trouble in finding sufficient reasons for this removal. It is not my province to participate in the discussion of this interesting question. As a soldier, however, who fought on the southern side and who has studied with much interest this campaign of General Rosecrans, I wish to leave upon record 2 or 3 inquiries which it seems to me history must necessarily make. First, how was it possible for the transfer of Longstreet's troops from Lee to Bragg to have escaped the attention of Secretary Stanton or General Halleck? This movement was reported to General Rosecrans by General Peck of the Union Army stationed in North Carolina. Another question which history will probably ask is why no reinforcements were sent to the Union Army while Rosecrans was in command, and when Longstreet was moving to strengthen General Bragg, and yet after Rosecrans's removal immense reinforcements were sent, although both Longstreet and Buckner had then been detached from that immediate vicinity. The heavy concentration of Union forces at Chattanooga and the consequent defeat of Bragg's army at Missionary Ridge was a master stroke, but justice to General Rosecrans seems to demand the above reflections. In the light of his previous strategic campaign and of his fight at Chickamauga, where, without reinforcements, he so stubbornly resisted Bragg's assaults while both Longstreet and Buckner were present, history will surely ask, what would General Rosecrans probably have accomplished with his own army heavily reinforced, while Bragg's was reduced by the absence of both Longstreet's and Buckner's commands? Missionary Ridge had added its quota of cloud to the Confederate firmament and intensified the gloom of the succeeding winter. It had laid bare the Confederacy's heart to the glistening points of Union bayonets and vastly increased the sufferings of the Confederate armies. Vicksburg, Gettysburg, Missionary Ridge. Distinct defeats to different armies in distant sections, they nevertheless constituted a common, a triune disaster to the Confederate cause. The great crevasses in the Mississippi's levees constitute one agency of ruin when they unite their floods and deluge the delta. So these breaks in the grey lines of defence constituted, I repeat, one common defeat to Southern arms. There is, however, this noteworthy defect in the completeness of the simile. The Mississippi levees could be rebuilt. The material for reconstructing them was inexhaustible, and the waters would soon disappear without any human effort to drive them back. The Confederacy's lines, on the contrary, could not be rebuilt. The material for reconstructing them was exhausted. The blue-crested flood which had broken those lines was not disappearing. The fountains which supplied it were exhaustless. It was still coming with an ever-increasing current, swelling higher and growing more resistless. This triune disaster was especially depressing to the people, because it came like a blight upon their hopes, which had been awakened by recent Confederate victories. The recoil of Lee's army from its furious impact against the blue barrier of Meade's lines at Gettysburg was the first break in the tide of its successes. Beginning with the marvellous panic and rout of McDowell's troops at Bull Run in 1861, there followed in almost unbroken succession wave after wave of Confederate triumph. The victory of Joseph E. Johnston over General McClellan at Seven Pines, or Fair Oaks. The rapidly recurring victories of Lee in the 7 days' battles around Richmond over the same brilliant commander, the rout of General Pope's army at Second Manassas, or Second Bull Run. The bloody disaster inflicted by Lee upon Burnside's forces at Fredericksburg and upon Hooker's splendid army at Chancellorsville, together with Stonewall Jackson's Napoleonic campaign in the Valley of Virginia, had constituted a chain of Confederate successes with scarcely a broken link. Even at Sharpsburg or Antietam in 1862, the result was of so indecisive a character as to leave that battle among those that are in dispute. The Federals claim it as a Union victory on the ground that Lee finally abandoned the field to McClellan. The Confederates place it among the drawn battles of the war and base their claim on these facts: that McClellan was the aggressor and declined to renew his efforts, although the Confederates invited him to do so by flying their flags in his front during the whole of the following day; that although the battle tide swayed to and fro, with alternate onsets and recoils on the different hotly contested portions of the field, yet in the main the Federal assaults were successfully repelled; that McClellan failed to drive Lee from his general line, and that whatever advance he made against Lee was more than counterbalanced by Jackson's capture of the entire Union forces which held the left of the Union Army at Harper's Ferry. Chapter 16. Winter on the Rapidan. The winter of 1863-64 on the banks of the Rapidan was passed in preparation by both armies for that wrestle of giants, which was to begin in May in the Wilderness and end at Appomattox in the following April. My camp and quarters were near Clark's Mountain, from the top of which General Lee so often surveyed with his glasses the white-tented city of the Union Army spread out before us on the undulating plain below. A more peaceful scene could scarcely be conceived than that which broke upon our view day after day, as the rays of the morning sun fell upon the quiet, wide-spreading Union camp, with its thousands of smoke columns rising like miniature geysers, its fluttering flags marking, at regular intervals, the different divisions, its stillness unbroken save by an occasional drumbeat and the clear ringing notes of bugles sounding the familiar calls. On the southern side of the Rapidan, the scenes were, if possible, still less warlike. In every Confederate camp, chaplains and visiting ministers erected religious altars, around which the ragged soldiers knelt and worshipped the Heavenly Father into whose keeping they committed themselves and their cause, and through whose all-wise guidance they expected ultimate victory. The religious revivals that ensued form a most remarkable and impressive chapter of war history. Not only on the Sabbath day, but during the week, night after night for long periods, these services continued, increasing in attendance and interest until they brought under religious influence the great body of the army. Along the mountainsides and in the forests where the southern camps were pitched, the rocks and woods rang with appeals for holiness and consecration, with praises for past mercies and earnest prayers for future protection and deliverance. Thousands of these brave followers of Southern banners became consistent and devoted soldiers of the cross. General Lee, who was a deeply pious man, manifested a constant and profound interest in the progress of this religious work among his soldiers. He usually attended his own church when services were held there, but his interest was confined to no particular denomination. He encouraged all and helped all. Back of the army on the farms, in the towns and cities, the fingers of Southern women were busy knitting socks and sewing seams of coarse trousers and grey jackets for the soldiers at the front. From Mrs. Lee and her daughters to the humblest country matrons and maidens, their busy needles were stitching, day and night. The anxious commander thanked them for their efforts to bring greater comfort to the cold feet and shivering limbs of his half-clad men. He wrote letters expressing appreciation of the bags of socks and shirts as they came in. He said that he could almost hear, in the stillness of the night, the needles click as they flew through the meshes. Every click was a prayer, every stitch a tear. His tributes were tender and constant to these glorious women for their labour and sacrifices for Southern independence. His unselfish solicitude for his men was marked and unvarying. He sent to the suffering privates in the hospitals the delicacies contributed for his personal use from the meagre stores of those who were anxious about his health. If a handful of real coffee came to him, it went in the same direction, while he cheerfully drank from his tin cup the wretched substitute made from parched corn or beans. He was the idolized commander of his army, and at the same time the sympathizing brother of his men. General Fitzhugh Lee, the brilliant nephew of the great chieftain, gives extracts from his private letters, some of which I insert in this connection because they illustrate the character of Robert E. Lee as a man. These excerpts are of greater value because they are taken from letters addressed to Mrs. Lee and meant for her eyes alone. In 1861, from West Virginia, General Lee concluded a letter to Mrs. Lee in these words: "I travelled from Staunton on horseback. A part of the road I travelled over in the summer of 1840 on my return from St. Louis after bringing you home. If anyone had told me that the next time I travelled that road would have been on my present errand, I should have supposed him insane. I enjoyed the mountains as I rode along. The valleys are peaceful, the scenery beautiful. What a glorious world Almighty God has given us! How thankless and ungrateful we are! Denied the privilege of being with his family at the Christmas reunion, he wrote, I shall pray the great God to shower his blessings upon you and unite you all in his courts above. Oh, that I were more worthy and more thankful for all that he has done and continues to do for me." From the southern coast in February 1862, he wrote Mrs. Lee, "My constant prayer is to the giver of all victory. The contest must be long, and the whole country has to go through much suffering. It is necessary we should be more humble, less boastful, less selfish, and more devoted to right and justice to all the world. God, I hope, will shield us and give us success. After his brilliant victory over McClellan in the 7 days' battles around Richmond, he wrote Mrs. Lee, I am filled with gratitude to our Heavenly Father for all the mercies he has extended to us. Our success has not been as complete as we could desire, but God knows what is best for us. If Wellington, the Iron Duke, ever said, as is reported, A man of fine Christian sensibilities is totally unfit for the position of a soldier. He must have had in contemplation the mere soldier of fortune, the professional soldier, and not the class of men who fight only because duty compels them to fight. The lofty Christian character, the simple, earnest Christian faith, the consistent, unostentatious Christian life and humility of spirit of both Lee and Jackson furnish an eloquent and crushing rebuke to Wellington's suggestions. Jackson fought while praying and prayed while planning. Lee's heart was full of supplication in battle, while his lips were silent. In sunshine and in storm, in victory and in defeat, his heart turned to God. Chapter after chapter might be filled with these extracts from his private letters and with accounts of acts consistent with his letters, illustrating the fact that great soldiers may be the tenderest men and the truest Christian believers. The self-denial, the stainless manhood, the unfaltering faith in the saving truths of the Bible, the enormous willpower, submissive as a child to God's will, the roundness and completeness of such a life should be a model and an inspiration to the young men of our whole country. Christian men and women, indeed all who truly love this country and realize how essential to its permanence and freedom is the character of its citizenship, must find no little comfort in the facts recorded in the last few paragraphs. The reward promised by mythology to the brave who fell in battle was a heaven, not of purity and peace, but of continued combat with their foes and a life of eternal revelry. Such a religion could only degrade the soldiers who fought and increase the depravity of the people. It was a religion of hate, of vindictiveness, of debauchery. The religious revivals which occurred in the southern camps, on the contrary, while banishing from the heart all unworthy passions, prepared the soldiers for more heroic endurance, lifted them in a measure above their sufferings, nerved them for the coming battles, exalted them to a higher conception of duty, imbued them with a spirit of more cheerful submission to the decrees of Providence, sustained them with a calmer and nobler courage, and rendered them not insensible to danger, but superior to it. The life we now live is not the only life. What we call death is not an eternal sleep. The soldier's grave is not an everlasting prison, but the gateway to an endless life beyond, and this belief in immortality should be cultivated in armies, because of the potent influence it must exert in developing the best characteristics of the soldier. Aside from any regard for the purely spiritual welfare of the men, the most enlightened nations of Europe have shown a commendable worldly wisdom in making religious literature an important part of an army's equipment. No one who calmly and fairly considers the conditions which surrounded the soldiers of the Confederate armies when they were disbanded and the manner in which these men met those conditions can doubt that their profound religious convictions, which were deepened in the camps, had a potent influence upon their conduct in the trying years which followed the war. Reared under a government of their own choosing, born and bred under laws, state and federal, enacted by their own representatives, habituated for 4 years to the watchful eyes and guarding bayonets of army sentinels, accustomed to the restraints of the most rigid regulations, they found themselves at the close of the war suddenly confronted by conditions radically, totally changed. Their state governments were overthrown, state laws were in abeyance. Of chosen representatives they had none. Sheriffs, other officers of the court, and the courts themselves were gone. Penniless and homeless as thousands of them were, with the whole financial system in their states obliterated, the whole system of labour revolutionized, without a dollar or the possibility of borrowing, they went bravely and uncomplainingly to work. They did not rob, they did not steal, they did not beg, they did not murmur at their fate. With all the restraints to which they had been subjected, both as citizens and soldiers, not only relaxed but entirely removed, they kept the peace, lived soberly and circumspectly, each ready to lend a helping hand to maimed and helpless comrades, or to fight again for the enforcement of law or in defence of the restored republic. Who will deny that these facts, which are in no particular and in no degree overstated, but fall far short of the reality, demonstrate the power of religious convictions over the conduct of these disbanded soldiers transformed into citizens under conditions so changed, so trying, so desperate. Chapter 17. The Wilderness Battle of May 5th. Lee and Grant, the foremost leaders of the opposing armies, were now to begin a campaign which was to be practically a continuous battle for 11 months. Grant had come from his campaigns in the southwest with the laurels of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Missionary Ridge on his brow. Lee stood before him with a record as a military executioner unrivalled by that of any warrior of modern times. A more beautiful day never dawned on Clark's Mountain and the valley of the Rapidan than May 5, 1864. There was not a cloud in the sky, and the broad expanse of meadowlands on the north side of the little river and the steep wooded hills on the other seemed apparelled in celestial light as the sun rose upon them. At an early hour, however, the enchantment of the scene was rudely broken by bugles and kettle drums, calling Lee's veterans to strike tents and fall into line. The advent of spring brought intense relief to the thinly clad and poorly fed Confederates. The Army of Northern Virginia had suffered so much during the preceding winter that there was general rejoicing at its close, although every man in that army knew that it meant the opening of another campaign and the coming of Grant's thoroughly equipped and stalwart corps. The reports of General Lee's scouts were scarcely necessary to our appreciation of the fact that the odds against us were constantly and rapidly increasing. For from the highland, which bordered the southern banks of the Rapidan, one could almost estimate the numbers that were being added to Grant's ranks by the growth of the city of tents spreading out in full view below. The Confederates were profoundly impressed by the situation, but they rejected as utterly unworthy of a Christian soldier the doctrine that Providence was on the side of the heaviest guns and most numerous battalions. To an unshaken confidence in their great leader and in each other there had been added, during the remarkable religious revivals, to which I have referred, a spiritual vitality which greatly increased among Lee's soldiers, the spirit of self-sacrifice and of consecration. Committing themselves and their cause to God, with honest and fervent prayers for his protection and guidance, they hopefully and calmly awaited the results of the coming battle. On the morning of May 4, 1864, shortly after midnight, General Grant began the movement which was soon to break the long silence of that vast and dense woodland by the roaring tumult of battle. This advance by General Grant inaugurated the 7th act in the On to Richmond drama played by the armies of the Union. The first advance, led by General McDowell, had been repelled by Beauregard and Johnston at Bull Run. The next 5, under the leadership respectively of McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, had been repelled by Lee. He had not only defeated these noted leaders, but caused their removal from command of the Union Army. Crossing the Rapidan with but little resistance, General Grant spent the 4th of May in placing his army in position. Pushing toward Richmond the head of his column, which was to form the left of his battle line, in order to throw himself, if possible, between Lee and the Confederate capital, General Grant promptly faced his army in the direction from which Lee must necessarily approach, and moved to the front as rapidly as the tangled wilderness would permit. Lee, in the meantime, was hurrying his columns along the narrow roads and throwing out skirmish lines, backed by such troops as he could bring forward quickly in order to check Grant's advance and to ascertain whether the heaviest assault was to be made upon the Confederate centre or upon the right or left flank. Field glasses and scouts and cavalry were equally and almost wholly useless in that dense woodland. The tangle of underbrush and curtain of green leaves enabled General Grant to concentrate his forces at any point, while their movements were entirely concealed. Overlapping the Confederate lines on both flanks, he lost no time in pushing to the front with characteristic vigour. My command brought up the rear of the extreme left of Lee's line, which was led by Ewell's corps. Long before I reached the point of collision, the steady roll of small arms left no doubt as to the character of the conflict in our front. Dispatching staff officers to the rear to close up the ranks in compact column so as to be ready for any emergency, we hurried with quickened step toward the point of heaviest fighting. Alternate confidence and apprehension were awakened as the shouts of one army or the other reached our ears. So distinct in character were these shouts that they were easily discernible. At one point, the weird Confederate yell told us plainly that Ewell's men were advancing. At another, the huzzahs, in mighty concert of the Union troops, warned us that they had repelled the Confederate charge. And as these ominous huzzahs grew in volume, we knew that Grant's lines were moving forward. Just as the head of my column came within range of the whizzing minis, the Confederate yells grew fainter and at last ceased, and the Union shout rose above the din of battle. I was already prepared by this infallible admonition for the sight of Ewell's shattered forces retreating in disorder. The oft-repeated but spasmodic efforts of first one army and then the other to break through the opposing ranks had at last been ended by the sudden rush of Grant's compact veterans from the dense covert, in such numbers that Ewell's attenuated lines were driven in confusion to the rear. These retreating divisions, like broken and receding waves, rolled back against the head of my column, while we were still rapidly advancing along the narrow road. The repulse had been so sudden and the confusion so great that practically no resistance was now being made to the Union advance, and the elated Federals were so near me that little time was left to bring my men from column into line in order to resist the movement or repel it by countercharge. At this moment of dire extremity, I saw General Ewell, who was still a superb horseman, notwithstanding the loss of his leg, riding in furious gallop toward me, his thoroughbred charger bounding like a deer through the dense underbrush. With a quick jerk of his bridle rein, just as his wooden leg was about to come into unwelcome collision with my knee, he checked his horse and rapped out his few words with characteristic impetuosity. He did not stop to explain the situation. There was no need of explanation. The disalignment, the confusion, the rapid retreat of our troops, and the raining of Union bullets as they whizzed and rattled through the scrub oaks and pines rendered explanations superfluous, even had there been time to make them. The rapid words he did utter were electric and charged with tremendous significance. "General Gordon, the fate of the day depends on you, sir," he said. "These men will save it, sir," I replied, more with the purpose of arousing the enthusiasm of my men than with any well-defined idea as to how we were to save it. Quickly wheeling a single regiment into line, I ordered it forward in a countercharge, while I hurried the other troops into position. The sheer audacity and dash of that regimental charge checked, as I had hoped it would, the Union advance for a few moments, giving me the essential time to throw the other troops across the Union front. Swiftly riding to the centre of my line, I gave in person the order, "Forward!" With a deafening yell which must have been heard miles away, that glorious brigade rushed upon the hitherto advancing enemy, and by the shock of their furious onset shattered into fragments all that portion of the compact Union line which confronted my troops. At that moment was presented one of the strangest conditions ever witnessed upon a battlefield. My command covered only a small portion of the long lines in blue, and not a single regiment of those stalwart Federals yielded except those which had been struck by the southern advance. On both sides of the swath cut by this sweep of the Confederate scythe, the steady veterans of Grant were unshaken and still poured their incessant volleys into the retreating Confederate ranks. My command had cut its way through the Union centre, and at that moment it was in the remarkably strange position of being on identically the same general line with the enemy, the Confederates facing in one direction, the Federals in the other. Looking down that line from Grant's right toward his left, there would first have been seen a long stretch of blue uniforms, then a short stretch of grey, then another still longer of blue, in one continuous line. The situation was both unique and alarming. I know of no case like it in military history, nor has there come to my knowledge from military textbooks or the accounts of the world's battles. Any precedent for the movement which extricated my command from its perilous environment and changed the threatened capture or annihilation of my troops into victory. The solid and dotted portions of the line here given correctly represent the position of my troops in relation to the Federals at this particular juncture. The Union forces are indicated by a solid line, the Confederates, my command, by a dotted line, and the arrows indicate the direction in which the forces were facing, it will be seen that further movement to Grant's rear was not to be considered, for his unbroken lines on each side of me would promptly close up the gap which my men had cut through his centre, thus rendering the capture of my entire command inevitable. To attempt to retire by the route by which we had advanced was almost, if not equally, as hazardous, for those same unbroken and now unopposed ranks on each side of me, as soon as such a retrograde movement began, would instantly rush from both directions upon my retreating command and quickly crush it. In such a crisis, when moments count for hours, when the fate of a command hangs upon instantaneous decision, the responsibility of the commander is almost overwhelming, but the very extremity of the danger electrifies his brain to abnormal activity. In such peril, he does more thinking in 1 second than he would ordinarily do in a day. No man ever realized more fully than I did at that dreadful moment the truth of the adage, necessity is the mother of invention. As soon as my troops had broken through the Union ranks, I directed my staff to halt the command, and before the Union veterans could recover from the shock, my regiments were moving at a double quick from the centre into file right and left, thus placing them in 2 parallel lines, back to back, in a position at a right angle to the one held a moment before. This quickly executed manoeuvre placed 1/2 of my command squarely upon the right flank of one portion of the enemy's unbroken line, and the other half facing in exactly the opposite direction, squarely upon the left flank of the enemy's line. This position is correctly represented by the solid, Federal, and dotted Confederate lines. This done, both these wings were ordered forward, and, with another piercing yell, they rushed in opposite directions upon the right and left flanks of the astounded Federals, shattering them as any troops that were ever marshalled would have been shattered, capturing large numbers and checking any further effort by General Grant on that portion of the field. Meantime, while this unprecedented movement was being executed, the Confederates, who had been previously driven back, rallied and moved in spirited charge to the front and recovered the lost ground. Both armies rested for the night near the points where the first collisions of the day had occurred. It would be more accurate to say they remained for the night, for there was little rest to the weary men of either army. Both sides laboured all night in the dark and dense woodland, throwing up such breastworks as were possible a most timely preparation for the next day's conflicts. My command was ordered during the night to the extreme left of Lee's lines, under the apprehension that Grant's right overlapped and endangered our left flank. Thus ended the 5th of May, which had witnessed the first desperate encounter between Grant and Lee. The fighting had not involved the whole of either army, but it was fierce and bloody. It would be unjust to claim that either of the famous leaders had achieved a signal victory. Both sides had left their dead scattered through the bullet-riddled underbrush. The Confederates drew comfort from the fact that in the shifting fortunes of the day theirs was the last advance, that the battle had ended near where it had begun, and that the Union advance had been successfully repulsed. It was impossible to know what changes in the disposition of his forces General Grant would make during the night. It was useless to speculate as to whether he would mass his troops for still heavier assault upon the positions we then held or would concentrate against Lee's right or left flank. All that could be done was to prepare as best we could for any contingency and await the developments which the morrow would bring.